Hello, NG Poland. How are you guys doing? Today, my topic is a plethora of rendering ideas. Well, it turns out that in recent times, there's been so many acronyms, so many terms associated with rendering that it makes our heads confusing and kind of blow up. So what I'm gonna do today is kind of take a couple of those ideas and explain them to you. And those ideas can be implemented with a little bit of effort in Angular. And the second part of my motivation for this talk is that Angular is gaining momentum when it comes to these topics. So this is a screenshot from Angular's roadmap, but you heard also earlier today Alex talking about those incoming improvements. Okay, but before we dive deeper, let me introduce myself. My name is Mateusz Do Duc. I'm an Angular developer like you guys, but at House of Angular. I'm also a speaker at Angular Warsaw meetups, so some of you guys might have already seen me. Okay, but let's place the right rendering in the right context. You've heard just Michael talking about rendering, template rendering, and etc. But this context that I'm going to talk about is a little bit different. So am I talking about browser rendering and how browser will essentially paint your stuff? Well, that's too low level. So let's zoom up, let's go up in the level. Am I talking about Ivy rendering? That's also too low level. So let's zoom out even farther ahead. And when we zoom out far enough, what we're gonna see that a small HTML with empty uproot after JS gets loaded and executed, suddenly blooms with DOM elements. So in SPA context, rendering is essentially executing JS to generate DOM. But you may think that's okay, that's for the browser, there's DOM and etc. What about server? Well, on the server, the process is very similar. We also execute JS, but there is no real DOM. It's a server-side implementation of DOM. And Angular uses Domino. And once that DOM gets generated, the thing can get stringified into transportable HTML. So if it magically finds its way to the browser, then the HTML and CSS can get immediately turned into DOM. That's not very interactive because there is no JS, so you're just seeing stuff, you cannot interact with it. But somewhere in the background, JS will get loaded, executed, and that JS will create a new DOM, and this process is called hydration. From this point, your app will work like your SPA. And it's destructive because you're not raising the old DOM, and that's something Angular will work on in the future. Also, the JS executed in the browser is very similar to the JS executed on the server. And that's why the JS is sometimes called isomorphic or universal JavaScript. Okay, so now, if we understand those two places, we can kind of start to classify rendering. And rendering, first helper question, where? If it's in the browser, then it's called client-side rendering in CSR. If it's on the server, then there is yet another question, helper question, that will help us. If it happens, when it happens. If it happens at build time, it's called pre-rendering or static site generation. SSG is the acronym. If it happens with a client request, then it's called server-side rendering, SSR. And this is Angular-specific terminology. Some other frameworks can name things a little bit differently. Okay, so why not just CSR everything? Why do we need to have those different options? Well, we have, with CSR, slow, largest contentful paint, because we have to make those couple of round trips to actually render the largest stuff. But there is not only this problem, we also have SEO issues. So not all crawlers can execute JS, and we cannot generate multiple link previews for our CSR application. It will have only one link preview. Okay, but let's talk about the first solution, pre-rendering SSG, because it's very simple. So essentially, first you have to pick a tool. You can pick Angular Universal, you can pick Scali, you can also import function render module, render application from platform server. Application is for standalone architecture, module is for modular architecture. And then you can save it to a file with essentially similar result. So then you essentially guess or define routes. And guessing is kind of an automatic process of detecting your routes. Defining is you define. And for those routes, you will create multiple index.html files with essentially a snapshot of your application at this point of time with all the requests made and etc. So server-side rendering, in contrast, well, it has only one tool and maybe a couple of others in the future, but right now it's just Angular Universal. And, well, the main point is that you have a server handling the traffic, rendering stuff for the user with that request, and querying the API. It runs on Node.js and Express, and you have to kind of worry about deploying it, and etc. So when should we use really what? Well, CSR is pretty great at everything except the public stuff. And especially it's really good at dev and cost friendliness, because Angular was created with CSR in mind. And SSR is good at public stuff, and especially at personalized content. On the other hand, it's pretty bad at cost. And you have to kind of maintain the server, and you have to write it in specific server-side, with server-side code, and etc. So it's difficult. And SSG is kind of in the middle, but in terms of difficulties, but it has a lot of access because it essentially snapshots your application. So if you have frequent data changes, you have to make those snapshots again. If you had a million pages, your build time will be crazy. You cannot have personalized content because you don't know who will be the user of your snapshots. OK, but can we figure a solution that kind of takes care of those excess and, for example, CSR without SEO X? Well, it turns out there are additional techniques that can help you essentially cover the weaknesses. So dynamic rendering is checking on CDN or on your web server whether the client request is a bot. If it's not a bot, you just return your CSR Angular application. But if it is a bot, then you can, for example, redirect the traffic to a third-party service like pre-render IO. And then your SEO is OK. And beside that, we have like an umbrella term called hybrid rendering, essentially mixing a lot of stuff up depending on, for example, routes. And for different client requests, for different routes, you can serve differently your content. So for home, I'm going to serve a pre-render page. But for book list with a lot of parameters, and I cannot pre-render all the combination of the parameters, I'm going to just do SSR. And this is supported in Angular Universal, so you can take a look at that. OK, and now comes kind of a king of hybrid solution. It's popularized by Next.js, but you can also import it and kind of do it in Angular. And essentially, the pattern is about having at the start just a subset of generated pages. And you can have those pages in a database, or you can have those pages as files, doesn't matter. Why a subset? Well, there is this Pareto rule, 80-20 principle. So in terms of web traffic, it says that 80% of your web traffic is generated by 20% of your pages. So just figure out what's the 20% to get the most of cost benefits. OK, so now we have just the subset of all the pages. And due to some events, over time, we're going to either generate new stuff or regenerate the old stuff that was outdated. So that's the pattern. And now we just have to figure out what are the events. And there are two kinds of approaches that we can take. The first approach are the incoming requests. So you see a client making a request. Let's say the page doesn't exist. It was not pre-generated before. And if it doesn't exist, then you have a choice. You can either SSR it or CSR it. And then if you SSR, you can cache it because you have already HTML, and you can save it in a database or in a file. If you CSR it, then you can pre-render the file and run the rendering. And if the page is outdated, you can do the same, exactly the same process, plus you have the additional option of returning stale content. And all those little variants depends on your, let's say, business needs. And the second approach is, instead of the traffic, you focus on the data changes from, let's say, observed CMS or observed database. And when the data changes, you essentially either regenerate pages that has stale data, or you invalidate if you, for example, want to use this pattern together with the first approach. Okay, but do I have any tips for implementation in Angular that you can take a look at? Number one, you can take a look at this library ngx isr. It won't have all the variants that I was talking about, but it's, you can still make a couple of ifs and things will work. And that library caches stuff in server's memory or file system. So if you want to go really production mode and optimize even further, then what you want to do is leverage CDN or external cache. CDN is the great equalizer when it comes to performance because SSR content or SSG content cached at CDN is the same, has the same speed. So you need to kind of work with CDNs and try to instruct those CDNs. And you instruct CDNs by headers. So here is a quick trick that you can do to figure out how to smartly set headers in your Angular Universal for CDN to understand. So here we have a server TS file. When you essentially create Angular Universal application, you will have such file, and this kind of block represents how your server handles requests. So the main thing that I'm doing, kind of without reading too much into the code, I'm creating a new object for every new request. And that object I'm passing as a provider. And in server-side Angular, I can mutate this object, use methods on that object to push some information into that object. And once server-side rendering finishes, I still have that object, so I can act on all the information stored to return proper headers for CDN to understand. And here I'm adding some cache declarations in my Angular, for example, in data services. And I'm saying, OK, this endpoint should be cached with type public, so a public cache with revalidation time 60 seconds, and with tags book47, because I made a request for a book by ID 47, I created a tag. And once I have a lot of those tags and a lot of those cache declarations, I can figure out what are the optimal headers. And essentially like saying, what's the worst case scenario? So if your application made 3 requests on the server side, and 2 of them were public, 1 of them was private, then you should treat entire page as private. But if you made 2 public requests, then you should take public cache, but with lower revalidation time. So figure out the worst case scenario. But I also want to store all the tags from all the endpoints that I consumed during server-side rendering. Why do I need to get all the tags? Well, there are 2 great problems in computer science. One is naming things, and the second is cache invalidation. And tags help with the latter. So essentially, I can say that I want to invalidate tag book47, and for that tag, I want all the page out of the caches. And this is a well-supported idea at CDNs. You have the most popular CDNs in the recent years accepting headers that kind of help you with that, like surrogate key, edge cache tag. Each CDN can have a different header that you need to manipulate to essentially link page to a tag, or multiple tags for that matter. OK, so next idea, since we're on the topic of clouds, is edge-side rendering. And what it is on the left, you can see that we have CDN in Las Vegas, but we have origin server that has Angular Universal and render stuff in Warsaw, Poland. And this idea wants to bring those 2 together. So we have at the edge, Las Vegas, in Las Vegas, both Edge and our Angular Universal application that runs for all of the clients that are very close to this node. And is it a good solution? right? To move closer to the edge and have at multiple edges our function with rendering. Well, there is one problem with that. What about if you need to still get the data? Well, turns out the request will take as long because your data, your database, is going to be still in Warsaw, or the entire infrastructure is still going to be in Warsaw. It's too hard to bring entire infrastructure to the edge. So this pattern is not good if you need fresh data from database, but it can be good if you never go beyond the edge to reach for data. So you only use the data present at the edge, for example, from the request or from other cache stuff at the CDN. And the last idea that I want to talk about is trisomorphic rendering. And I don't like this term. It's kind of complicated and it's not that well established, but you can find references to it, for example, on web.dev. What this idea is essentially isomorphism plus free. And same.js runs browser and server, and is supposed to also run in service worker. So you can render in any of those three things. But you cannot really do it very easily in Angular, which the service worker part, you cannot render that easily stuff with Angular. So in Angular, a similar concept that you can achieve is trisomorphic routing. And that term is essentially your SSR or SSG Angular plus PWA capabilities. And that's it. Then your navigation is handled in one of three ways. The user is a first-time ever visitor. Your stuff will get served by SSR or pre-render, whatever you choose. Or if it's an in-app navigation, then it's just CSR. But if it's a returning visitor, then the service worker has been installed, then you can handle things by service worker, decide what to deliver to the user. Since Angular 11, you can actually configure the last point with prop navigation request strategy. So these were the patterns that I wanted to talk about. And essentially, there are three closing thoughts that I think are important when it comes to this topic. The number one closing point is choosing rendering is just all about making trade-offs. So everything has pros and cons, and you have to figure out how to get the best out of things that you need for your business need with the least cost that you traded off. But the second point is that you can always mix things up. So mixing things up makes a solution more complex, but you can cover different cases, different parts of your application with different rendering approach. And the fourth point is that you shouldn't be afraid to look outside of the framework or frontend in general, because if, for example, it's not so widely talked about in Angular, but in another framework community, then you can look for the idea and see if it works for you in frontend. And also, the things can be even outside of frontend, like caching and CDN and Node.js, so you should seek information as well there. And this is all I have to talk about. Thank you very much.